All right, I'm going to review a little bit of some of the problems we have established since the beginning of the class. Well, the last week and a day. We all tend to think we know more than we actually know. Plenty of psychological studies have asked people to say how confident they are that they can explain something, and then have them actually explain it. And explaining something is about the only time, other than when the ways we think, the ways we operate, when they just fail to work. If I think I know how to work on a computer, if I think I know how to fix a bicycle, I'm never going to be aware of how little I know until something actually goes wrong, or I have to explain the thing that I think I have all the knowledge about. And so one of the ways you can sort of test your own knowledge is not just say, I feel confident that I know a lot about this thing. Rather than that feeling, actually ask yourself, okay, how would I describe it? Let me list out all the knowledge I think I have. And that forces us to sort of confront the fact that we don't know quite as much as we think we do. So we've got the illusion of explanatory depth. Obviously, the way to dispel that illusion is to actually explain something. Obviously, this is going to come into play when you sit down to write something, when you write an essay, when you try to explain something to your reader, that you're going to be confronted when you actually have to fill up that space on the blank page. But hopefully we want to engage with that. We want to dispel that illusion before then. We have a lot of heuristics are knowledge that are accurate-ish. And good enough to work most of the time. Rules like use I before E, except after C. That will help you remember whether to put I first or E first in words that have I and E together, except when it doesn't. So as long as it's not words like there, the possessive, second person, eight, C's, foreign, that kind of thing. A lot of times it will work. So in other words, our knowledge is usable most of the time. That's different than being accurate. And even really intelligent people, like the doctors that Jerome Grootman was writing about in the reading we did for the first class last week, tend to have a feeling of closure, that feeling that they know something, and they can come up with confirmation. They can come up with facts that actually seem to fit that pattern. But that's not really a way to test our knowledge. That's a way to just feel confident, to maintain that confidence. That's confirmation bias. Most of what we know comes from either just sort of the pattern recognition processes your brain has automatically, but also the communities of people, specifically the epistemic communities of people. That is the people from whom we learn things. And that can be people like your family, your friends, people you grew up with, authority figures, whatever that you actually communicated with or at least listened to. But it's also Google and Wikipedia and other sources of information that you go to when you need an answer to a question. This is a sort of act of conformity. It's not necessarily like the normative conformity we saw in the Solomon-Asch studies, where you think you know one thing, but other people adopt a different answer, and then people just sort of feel like they need to adopt the popular answer. That sort of normative conformity is something we do sometimes. It is itself following a heuristic. Notice it's a heuristic where instead of doing the thing I think is actually the better, more accurate thing, I'm actually going to do whatever other people are doing because I feel like they may know something I don't. But a lot of the times we don't even know that we're conforming. I need an answer. You give me an answer. Okay, I've got an answer. I'm motivated to seize and freeze on the first available answer. And that could be Google, it could be Wikipedia or whatever. I just want an answer. And once I have an answer, I feel closure. I feel like I've got all I need to have. I don't stop to think about the fact that I was really kind of lazy in grabbing that first answer. There's also the problem of the illusory truth effect, where you just hear something over and over again, it starts to seem more true, whether or not it is. And of course, if you're in an epistemic community, you hear something from one person, then you hear it from another person, then you hear it from another person. It starts to seem more true, but actually all the second, third, and fourth person you heard it from may have heard it from the first person. So we may actually all be getting our information from the same source. We just start repeating it to each other and it sounds more and more true. Creates this echo chamber problem. We have the opportunity to falsify our first thought or the community's assumption. That is to look for counter evidence, but we don't usually do that. The default thing we usually do is try to confirm it. even, in low stakes situations where, we're not running the risk of embarrassing ourselves, it just sort of seems like the thing to do to confirm my first intuitive answer, or the thing I think is the explanation. But we actually become more accurate when we try to prove ourselves wrong. So notice we're more accurate when we try to prove ourselves wrong, but we have a hard time trying to prove ourselves wrong. That's just not an instinct we have. That's just not a thing we feel like we need to do. We like the feeling of closure. We have this need to have that feeling of closure that leads us to seize and freeze on the first available answer. But that feeling also lends us to prefer people who also believe what we believe, to remove ourselves from people who don't affirm that belief or whatever, because they're not affirming our feeling, our confidence, our feeling of closure. They're actually threatening that feeling. That can lead us to adopt a soldier mindset, like the French military did when Lieutenant Colonel Picard pointed out to them that actually Alfred Dreyfus might not have been the spy that wrote that letter. They should have, as military intelligence guys, thought, oh, well, in that case, we need to be very sure there's not another spy out there. Never mind that we've convicted an innocent man. What if we're wrong? That means we still have a spy giving our information away. But that's not what they did. They wanted to maintain that feeling of closure, so they not only disparaged Picard, they not only called him a traitor and acted as if he was the problem, they even sent him on missions that they were hoping he wouldn't come back from. Like, they were willing to kill this guy just to make him shut up, even though he was actually trying to help them. That's just natural. It's not a good thing, but it is a natural thing because of this social aspect of knowledge. Because our communities tend to believe the same thing, sometimes belief is what attaches us to our community. And when someone threatens our belief, when they question it, when they challenge it, when they bring in new information, it becomes a social phenomenon rather than a literally epistemic phenomenon, where I'm no longer interested in finding the truth. I'm more interested in saving face, maintaining my status as an individual and as a member of this group, if my whole group believes this one thing. So we can see why this works. We can see how it works, but we can also see why it can cause some real problems. Critical reasoning is obviously the ideal, but it's something that's really difficult. Like the cognitive reflection test, where the bat and the ball problem, how much the ball costs, your default answer is 10 cents. You have to force yourself to say, wait a second, let me back up. If I had 10 cents and the bat costs $1 more, then the bat is $1.10, then that means the two together $1.20. That can't be right. So the same thing with the other elements in that cognitive reflection test. If you had the illusion of explanatory depth when it comes to riding a bicycle, you might say, okay, in my head, I think the pedals are on the front wheel, but what would happen, or what if the chain connected the gears on both the front and the back wheel, like one person who rode a bike every day thought it did? Well, then, it just wouldn't have that kind of traction. So if you give yourself a moment to stop and question things, that can help you be more accurate. That's the scout mindset. But there's another way to try to help yourself falsify your beliefs. If that's something that's really difficult to do, what's a strategy I can adopt that will help me find answers I hadn't thought of? Or, if I'm like the Army Air Corps engineers here, during World War II, these bombers are coming back, and this is where the bullet holes are. Before I say, okay, let's put the armor there, I haven't thought of any reason there's a problem with that. The other people at the table with me haven't thought of a reason there's a problem with that. Am I ready to go do that? Is there something else I can do? If you have a bias, to confirmation bias, to confirm what you already think, what strategy can you do to help yourself avoid that? Yeah, you want to play devil's advocate. What if you're not very good at playing devil's advocate? Can you go find another devil? You can ask somebody else. You can ask somebody who thinks you're wrong. And if you're sitting at a table where everybody's going, yeah, okay, you ask yourself, well, wait, is there any kind of normative conformity going on here? I really want to know, does anyone disagree? If you do, please speak up, because you are going to help all of us. And worst case scenario, you're wrong, in which case that's fine. But can anybody think of a reason we might be wrong? So in other words, I want to have a conversation. I want to have a back and forth, not just with other people who agree with me already, not with other people who have already conformed to the same answer, but to people who have not. People who are coming from another epistemic community where they believe something different, or somebody like Picard or Abraham Wald, the guy that figured out the problem with the bombers. I want to know, can somebody play devil's advocate? Can somebody else do for me what I can't do for myself, which is try to falsify what I already think? So when that happens, we have discourse. Discourse is a back and forth. So when you read a book and you just read it and then that's it, when you use informational conformity, you passively accept information. You passively accept belief. And there's nothing wrong with that. We talk about conformity as if it was a bad thing, but I mean, we need it to get through life. We can't stop and critically evaluate every single thing all the time. We depend on people. We depend on Google. We depend on Wikipedia. We depend on your GPS. If you can't use a map and compass, that's okay. You've got your phone until you don't. It might be good to learn that. It might be good to learn to keep track of landmarks and dead reckoning and those kind of skills that your generation and millennials too are kind of losing. But you have a heuristic that works most of the time. What was I going with? Most information we accept passively, we're not really critically evaluating it, but we want to be aware of that at least, especially if it's really important information. So discourse is not that kind of passive reception. Discourse is where you talk back and forth. So if, the official definition here, any organized body of statements and discussions governed by rules and conventions of which the users may or may not be conscious. In other words, there are certain things that you can, certain ways to reply when somebody says something, and certain ways to reply that would kind of cause people to raise an eyebrow, right? But we have conversations. If you tell me one thing and I say, well, what about this? Then you respond to that what about with something that either reinforces your previous statement or maybe, allows there might be questions. And when we do that, when this is back and forth, you say something and I respond to that thing. One way to sort of go against the rules and conventions of discourse would be you say something and I say something completely unrelated. But as long as we're talking about the same thing, we're going back and forth, we're not just repeating each other, then we're involved in discourse. And even when we're just two people, we have created a discourse community. So discourse community is any kind of community in which the members attempt to achieve cooperation and assert their individuality through the use of language, so through the use of discourse. Now notice there's two things happening there. Cooperation, but it's not just like you tell me what to do and I'll do it. I'm going to assert my individuality as well. Here's what I'm willing to do. Here's what I'm willing to believe. Here's what I'm not willing to believe. Here's what I'm willing to believe under certain criteria. Now let's agree on the criteria and then you see if you can supply that criteria. So this is not just information flowing in one direction. It's not just one person speaks and the other person listens. It is a back and forth, and we're united by an issue. And an issue is not a topic. This is not just something that I have no information about and you have all the information, so I just listen to you. It is something that we might have some disagreement about. It's a problem that we need to solve, and there's more than one way it might be solved. Or it's a question that has more than one possible answer. It's not just what is 2 + 2. Unless you want to, revise the criteria of mathematics, we're probably going to come to the same conclusion pretty quickly. But this is a question that does not have a quick and easy answer, or a situation that could have more than one plausible explanation. In other words, I think this happened because of this, but maybe it happened because of that. Let's talk about it. Do you have any other insights? So that issue is what you're going to start to think about when it comes to what you eventually are going to write your essays about. It's the kind of thing I want you to start thinking about as opposed to a topic. If you were writing a report, that is just you're going out and getting information and you're putting it in this document and submitting it, that's fine for a report, but you're not going to be writing reports in this class. You're going to be writing essays. Essays explore issues. We're going to get more into the definition of an essay and the comparison process. I mentioned it in the first day of class, how the word essay comes from the Latin word for testing, like you're weighing two things. But that's really going to be the focus of our next reading and what we talk about on Friday. But for now, an issue is going to require more than just information. It's going to require thinking about something that is a subject of disagreement, and it's something that's important. And so I'm throwing a different definition at you of another type of community, and you might be wondering, okay, how is a discourse community? Is it different than epistemic community? We learned that last time. And yes, they are different. An epistemic community is just the people you learn from. I put people up here. It could also be sources. It could be Google. It could be Wikipedia. That's part of your epistemic community. It includes a lot of passive acceptance of information, the kind of informational conformity we've looked at in the past, the illusory truth effect. It can create the illusion of explanatory depth. It may lead me because I've just heard this from all these other people, so I assume I know it. It sounds familiar. I've never had to stop and explain it because, hey, it's just common sense. Everybody knows this. You don't have to explain it. It gives me this feeling of closure. If everybody around me thinks the same way I think, I feel like, okay, this is good information. I can feel confident. Discussions within an epistemic community may consist entirely of confirmation bias. Let's all get together and talk about how we're so much smarter than those other people that think differently. I don't know how they got to their conclusion, but I mean, they got to be crazy to come to a different conclusion than we did, right? Right. Yeah. You ever had a conversation with somebody that's mostly just you guys just agreeing about everything? How much did you actually learn from that conversation? I mean, I feel closer to this person. That's the way we bond. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar has written, I mean, scientifically argued that kind of conversation is akin to what chimpanzees do when they groom each other. You know, when they pick lice off each other's backs, they go through each other's hair, pick lice, and then eat it. That's actually how they bond. And so they actually form alliances that way. But that's also how we bond. How much do you bond with somebody who's constantly telling you, no, you're wrong about that, and you're wrong about that? You feel an emotional, that feeling of closure you have, the feeling of confidence you have when you feel like you have an answer, you extend that to this other person who's affirming you because they're helping bolster your confidence, you're helping bolster theirs. You build this bond, but you might not be getting closer to an accurate understanding of things. So there's a function to that epistemic community and like positive reinforcement, confirmation bias, but it's more of an emotional one than it is an epistemic. There's not usually a lot of counter argument present. As opposed to the epistemic community, the discourse community, this is people you communicate with in order to cooperate, to solve a problem. Something brings you together, something's important, but you're going to draw boundaries. You're going to say, I'm willing to help up to a point, but here are my conditions. And I'm not just going to serve somebody else. I'm not just going to obey somebody else. I'm a cooperator. I'm not a servant. It usually involves counter arguments, different points of view, disagreements, challenges, questions, clarifications. This back and forth process of a discussion, discourse. And it can trigger the soldier mindset because you're coming up against people with whom you are interacting, but that social interaction might be more conflict, characterized by conflict. And so in that conflict, when somebody else challenges your belief and vicariously challenges the belief of your epistemic community, then you might feel defensive. You might feel like you and your group are going to lose status if it becomes known that you're inaccurate. So the motivation there is still social in that soldier mindset. The discourse community is more like the competition. Who's gonna win? Now these two can overlap. Your epistemic community, you can have discussions with people who mostly agree with most of what you believe over one little thing, or just something that's not really that relevant, so you don't mind being wrong about. Or it might just be that you recognize that you need to learn more from your epistemic community or something like that. But there are going to be people that you engage in discourse with who are outside of your epistemic community. An example of a discourse community that involves people from different epistemic communities are lawyers in a courtroom. If you are on trial for something, you have a defense attorney, and there's a prosecutor. The prosecutor wants to convict you, and your defense attorney wants to defend you. Do you want your defense attorney to listen to the prosecutor and go, I don't know, he made a good case. I guess we should just fold. I guess we should just admit guilt, huh? No, you want your defense attorney to bring evidence in your favor, make the rest of the court aware of things that the prosecutor is not going to make them aware of. These are people that have different presuppositions. Part of the job description of a prosecutor is to convict. Even if it's a weak case, present the best case that is available. Job description of a defense attorney is to defend, even if, I don't know, this guy seems kind of guilty, but I'm going to bring the best evidence I can because, that's my job. I might be wrong. It is their job to present different points of view, but they have to do it in the same courtroom. If you and your defense attorney just got together in a room and talked about all the reasons you're innocent, well, that's fine. It's just not going to get you acquitted any sooner. So there is this discourse, but it involves people with diametrically opposed conclusions. And it follows certain rules, like, certain things that the prosecutor and defense attorney can't present. Some evidence doesn't count. Some things they can't say, and the judge will make that very clear if they step over the line. And the jury, of course, is part of that discussion, part of that discourse community as well. They can't stand up in the middle of the courtroom and say, "Hey, wait, I have a question. Go back." But they can, during deliberation, say, "Okay, we have more questions for that witness, and we want this lawyer, we want somebody to ask these questions later." So they can actually change the court procedure later on. Another example of discourse community with with different epistemic communities is Congress. You know how the Republicans and Democrats are always like agreeing with each other and just being like, "You go first. No, you go first. You're right about that. No, you're right about that." They just agree too much, right? It's just boring. No, it's almost like they think the job is to disagree about everything and to obstruct everything. And if that party, gets what they want, then we must have lost. Our party must have lost. Like, they have to lose in order for us to win. Nothing can be mutually beneficial. I mean, logically, it should be that, most of what their job is to do things that are mutually beneficial for all Americans. But they sort of fall into this, this almost like a, pro and con, or prosecutor versus defense attorney, as if their job was to disagree. But regardless, they have to come together and talk. So they are part of the same discourse community, very different epistemic communities. It doesn't have to be that adversarial. Ideally, college is going to bring people together from different epistemic communities into a discussion, into the same discourse community. So you're going to find your roommates, your people that are in the same organization you're in, people in your classroom. You're going to have wildly different assumptions about the world that you didn't even know you had. You just thought that's just the way the world is until somebody else doesn't share that. That's a good thing. That's the way you learn how much you have sort of passively inherited, how much informational conformity you've been through, is when you come into contact with somebody who has not conformed to that prior belief. You're going to have new experiences. You're going to have new sort of expectations about what's healthy, what's unhealthy, what's a helpful way to study for an exam or do a project, what's not. What is certain, is something funny or something offensive? With my friends back home, especially in high school, like with high school males playing online video games, certain things that counted as funny, if you brought that into a face-to-face conversation, would probably not endear you to the people you're interacting with. So you got to realize, when you leave one epistemic community and interact with people from another one, you need to listen first, figure out what works, what doesn't. We've all been there, man. But unfortunately, what's happening a lot is polarization. That is, people, or these creations of these sort of bubbles of epistemic communities. So it used to be that when Facebook first opened, at first it was just college students, and then after a few years they opened it up to people who weren't in college. And so people started to interact with each other online, but that also meant like sharing news stories from sources that they followed. And they found really quickly that, like me and Uncle QAnon don't believe the same things about the world. And he's sharing things that I'm pretty sure batshit crazy, but I'm sharing things that he thinks make me a traitor. And he's just sort of like, I thought you were this because you were in my community. And as a result of that, people stopped following each other. They stopped sharing information with people that were outside their epistemic community because either they're offended and they think, okay, this is a bad person, but more often than not, they're just trying to avoid a fight. Like, I'm going to look for ways to share things with people who won't just turn that immediately into an argument. Plus, we like confirmation. We like when other people share and reinforce our feeling of closure. We don't like it when they challenge us. So people stop following people that have different political views, but also different social views, different views, any beliefs that challenges their feeling of closure. And what has happened is, as we've sort of unfollowed each other, we then share information that goes to people who already have heard that information, or they share it with somebody else who shares it with somebody else who shares it back with me. And then that illusory truth effect starts to happen. Because I keep hearing it over and over again, it sounds more and more true. But if I look at the sharing history, I realize, oh, that actually started with me. It's a big circle. It's like I'm hearing my own echo. That's why we call these echo chambers. It didn't always used to be this way. This is a graph not of Twitter, obviously. It wasn't around in 1949. But the US House of Representatives, times when Democrats would vote for Republican bills, Republicans would vote for Democrat bills, or there was bipartisan initiatives. That used to happen a lot more. And then in the late 80s, but especially the late 90s to today, it's become almost as if, the Democrats and Republicans were like prosecutors and defense attorneys. It's like their job is to disagree. So in the 90s, the Republicans supported like the individual mandate idea for healthcare. But then when Barack Obama said, okay, we'll include that in the Affordable Care Act, he said, oh no, that's now a Democrat idea. I have to vote against it. When George W. Bush supported some environmental protection legislation, Democrats said, well, if the Republicans are for this environmental protection, it must not really be very environmentally protective, so let's oppose it. So it's almost like people looked at party first and then looked at the issue. But this is something that's increased. This is a sort of breakdown. I'll put the blue and the red circles on there just kind of call attention to things. But things that were shared on Twitter, like the white ones are like nonpartisan. The purple ones are like Republicans and Democrats, or liberals, conservatives sharing liberal and conservative, mix. But there are these bubbles where in the blue bubble, there's very few red dots where people on the left have access to information sources from the Wall Street Journal or Fox News or something like that. And people on the right aren't reading the New York Times or the Washington Post, much less like Media Matters or Mother Jones. They're in these echo chambers, and only the people that are in both of those epistemic communities have access. Yeah.
How come there's a lot more red in the blue than there is a lot more blue in the red?
Well, because it seems to have that kind of it's something that happens a lot more on the right, and that's just people on the right don't like to hear that. I know I didn't like to hear that a while back, but that's just what the data is showing. Now, you will see that there are red dots all the way up into that other side, but there's this other like cluster over here. This is probably why things like QAnon can flow through a community and seem realistic, because there's nobody challenging it. So if somebody is in that sort of circle, they don't realize they're drifting that way. They don't realize that they're less and less connected to vetted, like researched information, especially when some of their sources are actively challenging the mainstream media. People use MSM or mainstream media as if it was like a dirty word. The thing about the mainstream media is, like, if they get something wrong, they're going to be confronted about it immediately. If you're separated from that, if you can just sort of make your own news, then there's nobody to fact check. And there's no doubt in the mainstream media you will find a lot of really biased coverage, and then you'll find it challenged by other people. But we have to ask ourselves, am I in a bubble? Because you can feel all smug and be like, hey, I'm on the left, so people on the left are much more open to other ideas. Well, one of the completely different studies showed that people on the left are much likely to unfriend somebody for having like right-wing views, which makes you wonder, like, how does it still end up that people on the left still interact with people? But you don't want to feel smug no matter which bubble you might be in, because being in a bubble just means being less accurate. All right, so there's going to be an issue. There's going to be some overlap. There's going to be some people that you interact with in your discourse community, also in your epistemic community. There are going to be some people outside of that, but the issue, the thing that is a problem in need of solution or whatever, is going to be out there outside of your epistemic community. That means it's going to be much more difficult to talk about. It's going to be much more difficult to maintain a scout mindset, but it's going to be something that is going to be easier if you have opposition, if you have someone to threaten your epistemic closure, because closure is not actually your friend if your goal is accuracy. Here's an example. The example of the kind of thing we're going to call an issue here, the kind of thing that I want you guys to start looking for. Have you guys heard of the 1619 Project? What have you heard about it? Terrible how?
It was introduced into schools, and then quickly after, like, people looked at it and like quickly rejected the whole idea. No, like, never taught after like a certain period.
Okay, so I'm guessing you didn't get that from the New York Times.
Yeah.
So let's back up. So it is something introduced into school curricula, specifically like American history classes, but it didn't start with like Department of Education or even with a textbook. It started with the New York Times. So the New York Times actually created the 1619 Project, and it was a collection of essays and research articles by historians, anthropologists, other cultural scholars and academics that looked at, starting with the year 1619, when the first slave ship arrived in North America, or at least in Anglo-America, and looked at the systems that were sort of institutionalized at that time and how they've had these sort of echo effects lasting down to today. Also about how this challenges the narrative that the Anglo-Europeans that landed here just created America just from their own hard work, and that was it. Like nobody was on the land. Native Americans, we gave them some beads or something. I'm sure they were fine with that. And then the black slaves we brought over here, well, that was unfortunate. We shouldn't have done that, but we really built everything ourselves. The 1619 Project starts with a very different premise, which is without slavery and without relocation, a nice euphemism for it, of Native Americans, we would not have been the success we were. So that's a very different idea than what we usually get from our history books. But beyond that, there are institutions which can continue down to today. Like these are some of the articles that appear in the 1619 Project. One by like Kevin Cruz. What does the traffic jam in Atlanta have to do with segregation? We might think, oh, those two things can't possibly have anything to do with each other. He goes into sort of how neighborhoods were set up, why they were set up that way. Things like you may or may not know, Wall Street in New York was actually built along the wall of the fortress of New Amsterdam as a place to sell slaves and buy slaves. So the bidding that people now do over stocks was originally done for people in stocks. The sugar trade that saturates the American diet has barbaric histories, the white gold that fueled slavery. So before, we associate slavery with cotton production, but it was actually, before that, it was sugarcane plantations that Africans were imported here to serve on. And the sugar industry has never really shown a great deal of compassion for the lives of its consumers or its employees. But those sorts of institutions, also the criminal justice system, or at least the incarceration rates of African Americans, and the fact that former plantations like Angola in Louisiana are now prisons, these are not coincidences. But this requires a lot of in-depth research into the history of those institutions. Now, that's the way it's explained by the New York Times and by the articles themselves. If you came to the 1619 Project from other points of view, like if you heard Tucker Carlson talk about it, or the Cato Institute, the conservative think tank, or Mitch McConnell on the floor of the Senate, Mitch McConnell said families did not ask for this divisive nonsense. So he's already labeling it as divisive nonsense. He's not saying, here's my problem with the facts that these historians bring up. Americans never decided our children should be taught that our country is inherently evil. So he's already assuming the 1619 Project is just teaching that America is evil. The Cato Institute says, in seeking to debunk American principles, the 1619 authors were led to ignore history, to disregard some of its most moving and revealing aspects, and most importantly, distort the metaphors whereby we became and continue to be one people. All right, so you see that they, unlike McConnell, unlike Carlson, they at least say, okay, well, there is a fact dispute here. And they get into a little bit of that in the article that comes from. But mostly they're talking about metaphors. Metaphors, values, not facts. So if you're a historian, your goal is to point out facts and say, okay, We're looking at what the realities were and looking at how one thing causes another. Now, these are things that can be disputed, but when it comes to values, that's something different. And if you're determining whether something is factually accurate or not based on whether it suits your values, then that might not be the most accurate thing. It's like defending the feeling of closure. I feel comfortable in my knowledge and I feel good about it. I don't want other people to change it. I don't like these facts that don't fit in with that pattern. We can see this is a familiar aspect that everybody goes through when somebody challenges something we believe, especially when it's identity related. When you consider yourself as like part of the group that created America, created our constitutional democracy, this might seem to challenge that. This might seem to challenge the idea that, you know, our ancestors created America by their own hard work. Somebody's saying that, well, it was actually somebody else's hard work. It was actually somebody else's dispossession that enabled that. So you can see that if you come to the 1619 Project through this information, this epistemic community, you have a very different sense about what it is than you would if you came to it through another one. And that's not to say that there's not, you know, to say that the reaction to the 1619 Project was undeserved and, you know, disproportionate, is not to say that there are not problems with the writings in the project itself. But if this is history, then history has certain criteria. Among those criteria are not included, do you want this to be true or not? Does this make you feel good in the present? Those are not historical criteria, but the facts and does one thing cause another, those are historical criteria. So this historian, Leslie Harris, was someone who thought the 1619 Project was a good idea, but saw factual inaccuracies there and worried that those factual inaccuracies were going to misrepresent the people at the time and also undermine the entire project, undermine the credibility, the ethos, the credibility of that entire project that was, on the whole, she thought a good thing. And so, you know, she says, I helped fact check, the title of the article is, I helped fact check the 1619 Project. The Times, New York Times ignored me. The paper series on slavery made avoidable mistakes, but the attacks from its critics are much more dangerous. So clearly, this is not somebody that's like, yay, 1619 Project all good, or 1619 Project all bad. It's somebody who's saying, okay, important project, important information, some of it's overstated, some of it uses inaccurate information. Yeah, yeah, so it's like recognizing, okay, this side has a bias and this side has a bias, and it seems that, you know, not necessarily middle ground, but just accuracy. So, you know, we'll talk later about the false equivalency. That's where, like, some people think the earth is flat, some people think it's round, so maybe it's oval shaped. Well, no, we don't want to do that, but we do want to say, okay, what are the facts that are independently verifiable? We'll get to the values later, but just like, what do we know? What do we not know? What inferences are we making? And that's what this author is doing. So I have an issue. The issue here is the 1619 Project, its accuracy, its relevance to us today, the motives behind it, what does it say, you know, and is it being used as like indoctrination, or is it being used as it is intended as education? It is related to it, but that is, and they get kind of merged, but critical race theory emerges from legal scholarship, and it is used the same way in like general media discussion. So people that are attacking the 1619 Project are also going to attack critical race theory, and they're going to mischaracterize both. But that brings up another good point. I'm isolating a particular issue, and there are other issues that might seem connected to it. But if I'm really trying to get to the heart of a particular issue and understand how other people understand it, then I also have to say, okay, well, let's separate it from this and separate it from this. So I might want to separate it from what I've also heard about critical race theory. I might want to separate it from like feelings of patriotism and things like that and say, okay, well, neither of those things have a real impact on what exactly this particular project was, what information it was presenting, and how accurate that information is. So notice, none of this is easy. None of this is like picking a side and like cheering for that side and trying to like, you know, boo the other side. It is difficult. And that's what, and that brings us to the reading for today. Stuart Greene's argument is conversation. When you enter into a conversation, imagine you're already part of the conversation. You're talking to 3 or 4 of your friends, And then somebody else, walks up and he hears like something about the 1619 Project. And he says, oh, I heard it was all this, right? This just proves that, white people are evil and just want to, the entire country is built on a lie and everything you learn in your American history book is wrong. Well, first of all, like that person doesn't actually know what we've covered in the conversation so far. We may have already gotten to a much more subtle point in the discussion, like the one I just showed you where, okay, yeah, it is talking about a lot of facts that we haven't dealt with, but there are also some misstatements. So if somebody else is coming into the conversation and sort of backtracking, so we have to go back and say, okay, yeah, we talked about that point of view, but here's what's wrong with that. Notice that it sort of disrupts the whole conversation. So you don't want to be that guy. When you walk up to a conversation already in progress, you want to stop and listen a little bit, just so you know specifically where they are, right? And you kind of appreciate it when other people do that too, when they don't make you like have to backtrack and say, yeah, we mentioned that earlier. Now, if you do want to say like, have you guys heard about this? It's better to ask that as a question first. You're still in the sort of listening, figuring out what the conversation's covered already stage. Then you're in a much better position to bring in, if you do have something new to add, you want to be sure first that it's new and that it fits in with what's been said so far. So like Greene says, you're never the first to broach a topic about what you're writing. So learning how to write a researched argument is a process of learning how to enter conversations that are already going on in written form. And those conversations already have a historical context. So what I just went through with like, okay, the 1619 Project started in the New York Times is this, here's their version of it. Here's the some of the backlash to what people thought it was. And then here's somebody else saying, okay, well, the backlash isn't entirely justified, but there are also problems with the things being written by people in the project itself. That's a multi-part conversation that I want to include all of it. I want to be as clear as possible about, I want to make sure I understand this version. I want to be sure I understand the criticism. I want to be sure I understand why people are making the assumptions about it that they're making. So I want to know the historical context of this discussion. I don't just want to hear 1619 Project and jump in and say, here's what I think about that. I'm a patriotic, proud American, therefore I don't accept the 1619 Project. Well, it's not that simple. You can be a proud, patriotic American and say, we did a lot of great things in the 18th century. We did a lot of not great things as well. And again, all this is in your reading for today. I put this in the PowerPoint just because they still haven't added Adobe Acrobat Reader in here, so I can't just use my bookmarks. He gives the example from Kenneth Burke, famous rhetoric scholar, about the conversation is there and it was going before you arrived, and it's going to keep going after you're gone. So you're hoping people that have just arrived at the conversation have listened to you because you can't stay there forever. It's going to go on without you as well. Every argument you make is connected to other arguments. Every time you write an argument, the way you position yourself will depend on three things: which previously stated arguments you share. In other words, your epistemic community. There are some things you agree with people in your discourse community, but there are some things that are new, some things you don't agree with. So what new opinions and supporting information, which previously stated arguments do you want to refute? In other words, in that conversation, somebody said something that you see a problem with. Either it's inaccurate or is illogical jump from one belief to another. And then what new opinions, what new supporting information do you want to bring to that conversation? Those three things are going to help you sort of figure out what is to be said. But at this point, you haven't sort of listened to the conversation yet because you haven't decided, in a lot of cases, what conversation you want to be a part of. 2 minutes. On Blackboard, in the essay project tab on the right, if you click on that, that's what you'll click on when it's time to submit an essay, your annotated bibliography, your research proposal, which is due a week from Friday. But right now, it's not an assignment, it's just a guide about what you should be doing right now. And what you should be doing right now is looking for an issue. And an issue, like Greene says, it's a question that doesn't have an easy answer or a solution to a problem that's not super obvious. And the best way to sort of look and see which of these conversations you want to enter into is just to browse. That's why I give you a bunch of links here, websites like The Conversation. I'm going to add in some more like political ones. Like Politico is a good one because these relate to things you'll be talking about in Dr. Diller's class. ProPublica, The Economist, that kind of thing. And just browse and see which of these issues you find interesting. You don't have to pick one of the usual ones like gun control, abortion, or legalization of marijuana. I'm sure half the papers that I get will be on one of those three topics, but keep in mind there's less and less to say because there's so many like pre-packaged arguments out there, and most of them talk past the opposition. They don't actually say, okay, here's what this side says, and here's how it actually, here are the things we have in common, that sort of thing. People frequently talk past each other then. But just look for something that interests you, that you're willing to investigate more. And your interest in this conversation is really going to be what makes or breaks the whole semester in this class for you. So if you have things you're not sure, is this a political thing? Does this fit into the learning community theme? Ask me about it, but it probably does because so many things from, masks and vaccination and global warming, things like this that should not be political, they end up being political because what you do in the world has effects on other people. When things affect other people, you have to get together and decide, what the regulations are going to be, and regulations are where the government process starts. So look for issues that interest you. Think about the conversation surrounding it. Don't feel like you have to know everything about it right now. Don't pick something just because it's familiar and you feel really confident about it. Confidence is not necessary, especially at this point in the project. And in fact, confidence is probably not going to be your friend at this point. All right, read Jack Mylan's essays, Persuasion or Inquiry for Friday, and read this on the essay project section of Blackboard. I'll see y'all Friday.
It's where the moral standings of prescribed